here comes Grim.
About 3,000 of you subscribe, but only about 200 are getting notifications, so click the bell and click all. Hello lovelies, today we're going to have a rather quick review / flip through of Acquisitions Incorporated. Acquisitions Incorporated was a campaign, is a campaign, that involves the people from the Penny Arcade webcomic and the PvPonline webcomic and various other personalities and so on, mostly associated with the conventions that Penny Arcade run. This was Critical Role before Critical Role was Critical Role, and ended up being somewhat overshadowed because streaming wasn't quite so big back in 2009 as it has become by 2015 when Critical Role started, and certainly how it's been since COVID and everything, which has rather accelerated that natural transition, I think. And this was performed live a lot of the time in front of convention audiences. So it's a very performative sort of setting and idea and game. And I think this, having a sourcebook for it, is very much an afterthought from when they were performing and doing the game in front of people. And it's comedy. It's set in Faerun, though its own sort of version of Faerun, I suppose. And it kind of plays into some of the more Discworldian aspects of Faerun, the magical technology that's not really technology in a lot of ways, these parallels to the real world. That's where it takes its comedy from, is, you know, what if we translated certain things from our real world into a fantasy world? How would that all play out? The structure of the game, the idea around the game, is that you're playing a franchise of Acquisitions Incorporated, which is a sort of privateering, money grubbing, fairly mercenary, sort of neutral oriented sort of guild, but not really a guild. It's run more like a corporation or a company, and it does seem to exist in its own sort of parallel Faerun, like I've said, and clearly owes a lot to comedic fantasy like Magic Kingdom for Sale Sold and Discworld, obviously, like I've said, those sorts of wry, tongue-in-cheek takes on the fantasy genre. Even those where the people in the fantasy world or in the game are somewhat breaking the fourth wall and somewhat familiar with the conventions of the game. That's less strong of a theme, but it does come through somewhat. So you're running a franchise of Acquisitions Incorporated somewhere in the Forgotten Realms. So it has all the baggage of the Forgotten Realms, plus it really, like I say, seems to exist within its own sort of splinter dimension where certain things are different. The franchises, like franchises in the real world, have to be run in a certain way. They have certain roles to fulfill. They have human resources. There's a lot of rules in here about making your headquarters, running your headquarters, the sort of day-to-day minutiae, but it's done in a way that is a set of comedic prompts, really. You know, it's an exaggerated version. So you've got staff, you've got hirelings, you've got a certain structure, you've got obligations as part of the franchise. There's a sort of base building idea within it, not as deep as in something like Conspiracy X or even older versions of D&D when it came to creating and running strongholds and so on. Pendragon does that very well, but in a very serious tone. It's something that a lot of games rich adventurers end up doing, but it's not particularly explored in the rule books. Minus the comedy side, a lot of this could be used to run guilds, create strongholds, staff them with hirelings, all of those sorts of things. There's a few additional rules for your various classes, nothing hugely particularly stand out, it's all fairly interesting. The art style draws on its webcomic heritage quite a lot, which I find refreshing and interesting and different to the kind of muddy, samey sort of art style that you find in a lot of D&D books. Some of it doesn't work particularly well, other parts of it do work particularly well. Like I say, it's definitely very refreshing and different, more graphical and stylistic than a lot of the D&D artwork has been for a lot of time. There's plenty here. I don't want to spoiler any of it. I think half the fun in most books is in discovering it, but there are rival organizations. There are groups that may have problems with Acquisitions Incorporated and so would have problems with you as a franchisee. There's stats for all the NPCs from the game. But all of this has been largely overshadowed by Critical Role, unfortunately. Because I think Acquisitions Incorporated better captures the spirit of gaming, at least on a meta level, kind of joking around the table. It's performative D&D, but it's more D&D than Critical Role is, I think. If I had to describe this, I'd describe it as either The Office or Office Space mixed with fantasy. In the same way that the Laundry Files RPG is Call of Cthulhu mixed with The Office or Office Space. So you'll spend a lot of time defeating monsters of bureaucracy as much as you will monsters outside. And that's where the satire and comedy works. Now, as I have often said and will continue to say at length to anyone who will listen, I'm sure, the two genres of role-playing that are the hardest to make work, the hardest to get across at the table, during play, in the game, are horror and comedy. Horror, you have some easy get-outs, in that you can go for grossing people out. You can describe things in a particularly horrific way, or disgusting way. You can try to creep out your players by pushing their real life phobias and buttons to make them uncomfortable at the table, as they should be in a horror scenario. This of course goes against a lot of what conventional ideas, conventional wisdom these days amongst the newer cohort of gamers. It goes against what they say. Consider conventional wisdom to be a forest. I am a chainsaw, you are squirrels. As the League Against TDM once said, if you're trying to enact horror, you need to horrify, disgust, and unsettle the players at the table. Otherwise, you might as well be watching one of the Scream parodies or something. And Scream itself was a parody, so there you go. But when it comes to comedy, you don't have that many easy get-outs. You can use references. You can make fart and dick jokes, I suppose, but it's just not as easy. Acquisitions Incorporated as a game worked because the people at the table were all webcomic artists who relied heavily on comedy, or other people who were particularly talented, at least in or adjacent to that field, and they could make it work at the table. This is similar to how Critical Role creates an unrealistic expectation of D&D through its highly polished nature compared to regular gamers playing games at the table. But it does have some of the mitigating structure that makes the few successful comedy games really work. The comedy game that really works is Paranoia, and that works because it is so tightly structured and it creates expectations in the players coming to the table that they're going to turn on each other at the slightest provocation, but that it's okay and that it's funny because you've got backup clones for your character, and you have to get through all 6 of them before you permanently die. But you get your mission, you get your mission, you requisition your equipment, you go to R&D, you get some comedically lethal experimental equipment which you have to use during your mission, and just the whole nature of the oppressive society of the computer and its deranged anti-communism makes the whole thing work, makes the whole thing funny. It's a satire upon a sort of McCarthyite America in some ways, and on certain kinds of science fiction, like Logan's Run and so on. So Paranoia works because it draws on all those sources, it references all those sources, and because it's got this tight structure that makes the comedy work. Because the structure itself is comedic, the ideas themselves are ludicrous. This isn't quite there. It's half of the way there, but you still need people at the table who are ready and willing to make the effort to be comedic. And that's difficult, and you can't really expect it of everybody. But this is an often forgotten arena of role-playing in general, and Dungeons and Dragons in particular. It always used to be rife with puns and in-jokes, nudges and winks and sly asides and things like that, and people were constantly quoting Monty Python or other comedic greats, influences that everyone knew and understood around the table. I'm not sure what you'd go to for that now. I don't know that in our sort of splintered internet archives, everything from all time is available. I don't know that there are those common touchstones necessarily that would work in the same way. But you can always do puns. We're coming to the close of the book, so hopefully that's given you a kind of overview of what there is here. Scoring this is going to be difficult. Style-wise, it's much more readable than a lot of D&D books that have been put out. The more graphical, cartoony style is hugely refreshing compared to everything else. So style-wise, I can't fault it too much, but it does suffer from D&D-itis, the same sort of layout, without really leaning into what it purports to be. So I can't give it the full 5, but I will definitely give it a 4 out of 5 for style. A lot of that is just due to it being refreshingly different. In terms of substance, there is a lot here. It is useful. It's not necessarily something you can incorporate into your standard Faerunian campaign or to other worlds particularly easily, because it rests upon a lot of assumptions, but also makes a lot of new assumptions and changes. So the substance isn't necessarily transportable, and being keyed towards comedy, it's not necessarily got what you need to transfer that into a more serious game. That said, it is packed with useful stuff. It just can't be transferred elsewhere. It's also much more useful, much more interesting, I think, for being set within Faerun, and because the people behind it had a better understanding of what D&D was and is, and playing it as a game more than as a performance, which really comes through in the Critical Role stuff, which is quite sort of bland by comparison. So in terms of substance, I'm going to give it a 4 out of 5, but you should only give it a 3 if you're not that interested in comedy and you can't use that kind of material within your own game. So taking the higher scores, that's 8 out of 10, 4 out of 5, recommended, worth picking up, but less so if you're not so into comedy. It's been called misogynistic, racist, a hate group, reactionary. It's been blamed for Trump, for keeping women out of games and technology. None of this is true. If you want the real story, then you need to buy Inside Gamergate.